How's it going, guys? I'm Mike Dwyer from the Bunker Recordings and BetterMixes.com, and today I'm going to show you how I mix a snare drum. I've had a handful of people recently telling me that they really like the sound of my snares on these tutorials I do. So I figured I'd break down what I do to get that sound. So the song I'm using here is the same one I was using in my video about amp sims. I had a couple people specifically mention the snare in that video, so I figured I'd use that one as an example. So first, let's just listen to our finished drum mix, just so you can see where we're heading. All right, so now let's see how we got there. So I'm going to start by soloing up my snare top, and I'm going to turn all my processing off and my reverb. So this is just our raw snare top. So not super exciting. There is a little bit of processing going on this because it is going through my drum bus and my parallel drum bus. You can check out the video I did on my parallel drum bus to see what's going on with that. But basically, we just have a little bit of parallel compression and just a touch of EQ. But anyway, let's see what we did to process this snare. So first up, I have Oxford Drumgate. And I've already made a whole video on this, so you can check that out for a detailed explanation of this plugin. But basically, it is just the best drum gate in the world. Let's check it out. And without it. And once more with it. So we're just chopping out all the bleed, and we have a pretty short decay time on our top end, but we're letting the low end ring out a little bit longer. Then next up, I have an instance of Pro Q3, and we're just doing some basic tone shaping here. This is some of the EQing I did while I was tracking this song. So this was on from the start. Let's check it out. So cleaning it up a little bit and really brightening it up. We have our high pass set to 170 Hertz, just cutting out any low end stuff that doesn't need to be there. Doing a bit of a dip around 500 Hertz, about 3.5 decibels. Let's check that out. So just cleaning up that mud a little bit. And then a big old boost, about 5.5 decibels, around 9K. So adding some nice top end and sizzle. Then next up, we have a compressor, and I'm using the plus 10 dB from Boz Digital. And I absolutely love this compressor on snare. It's just kind of magic. Let's check it out. So that's really adding some weight. So we've got a 3-to-1 ratio, the slowest attack that this compressor does, and a pretty fast release. And let's see how much gain reduction we were getting. So it looks like maybe 10 decibels of gain reduction. So a lot. And a big part of the reason I love this compressor on snare so much is the saturation that it has. As you can see, I'm driving both the input and the output pretty hard, and that just really helps to beef up the snare. Let's do a before and after again. So obviously quite a bit louder. Unfortunately, it's kind of hard to properly level match this compressor because I like the sound of driving the output so much. If I were to bring the volume of this down to match the input, I just wouldn't be getting all that color that I really like from this compressor. But hopefully, even with the level difference, you can hear how much weight that's adding. So next up, I have another EQ, and we're just doing some carving here. Let's do a before and after this. So really cleaning up the mid-range. Let's take a look at these moves one by one. So first we have a 6 decibel cut around 1.4K. So just kind of smoothing that out, making it a little more tame. Then we've got a 3 decibel cut around 550. So just cleaning up some of that tubbiness there. Then we've got a big old cut here, almost 9 decibels at 280 hertz. So there was just one overtone there that was really sticking out. Sometimes the overtones on snares can be really nice and really help the sound, but this one was just too much. So I just used a really narrow Q to dip that out. Let me just solo that frequency so you can hear it. So that's really helping. And then we've got another narrow cut here, right above 400 hertz. We're cutting about 4 decibels. Let's check that out. So that was just another one of those weird overtones that was just sticking out a bit too much. And then finally, we've got a tiny cut here, 1.8 decibels at 5K. So just smoothing that out a little bit. Once we put the compressor on, it was really bringing out kind of that ratty sound, so we're just ducking that down a hair. Then next up we have Spl Transient Designer, and we are boosting both a bit of attack and sustain. Let's check that out. So this really goes along with this last plugin that we're going to talk about. So I'll mention this again, especially the attack knob. The attack is really what goes with this. Cranking up the sustain a bit is just trying to give a little bit of extra length to this snare. But next up we have Evo In, and once again I made a whole video about this, so you can check that out. But we're not actually doing anything on this. This is just so that we can get our snare bottom track super in phase with our snare top. And then finally we have Lo-Fi, which is just a stock Pro Tools plugin. And we're just cranking the distortion knob up a bit. Let's check that out. All right, so we're hitting that pretty hard. It's getting fairly crunchy there. And normally I wouldn't push it that far. I would either have the distortion knob lower or lower the level going into it. But in this case, for this particular song, I really wanted the drums to just be super huge, massive, explosive. So having that crunchiness in the snare kind of helped achieve that. Like I said, you can just back this down lower or send less level into this plugin, and it'll really help to beef up the snare without actually audibly being distorted like this. But real quick, let's go back to our Transient Designer and put this in and out now that we have the Lo-Fi plugin on. So yeah, by adding extra attack before the Lo-Fi plugin, it kind of allows the Lo-Fi plugin to really smash the transient without messing with the tail of the snare quite as much. But anyway, let's do a before and after of all of our processing on our snare top. So here's where we started. And here's where we ended up. Pretty big difference. Now let's take a look at our snare bottom. So this is how it was recorded. First up, once again, we have Oxford Drumgate. So just getting rid of the bleed. Then we have FabFilter Pro Q3 again, doing a similar move to this first EQ over here. Not quite the same. We're boosting a little bit higher up, all the way at 11K, and cutting a little bit higher at about 1.1K. So let's check this out. So really cleaning up the mid-range and bringing out that nice sizzle. And that's primarily what I want from the snare bottom, is a lot of that extra sizzle. Because if we boost much more top end on our snare top track, even with as good of a job as Oxford Drumgate does of cutting out the bleed, it'll still be bringing in more of the cymbals. which we don't want. So we can get a little bit more top end from our bottom mic, which doesn't have as much cymbal bleed in it. So then next up, I have the Mcdsp 6030 Ultimate Compressor, and we're using this bottom module here, the D357, which is super, super aggressive. Let's check it out. So we're really smashing that down, kind of making it a little bit longer sounding. And again, that's the kind of go with the theme that I was talking about a minute ago with this song, where I just wanted these really big explosive sounds. This is just helping to drag out the length of the snare. And then the last thing we have is Evo in, which like I mentioned before, is just adjusting the phase. So let's hear that with the snare top. We only have a little bit of this mixed in because I was getting most of what I needed from the snare top. Let's check it out with and without this. So just adding a little bit of extra sizzle. Let me crank this up for a second so I can hear it better. And then finally, we have our snare sample. And the purpose of the sample in this was, again, I wanted this big, huge, explosive sound. And I just wasn't quite getting it from my natural snare tracks. Part of this was kind of a mistake with tracking too. I knew I wanted fairly big, explosive sounds, but I didn't quite realize when we were tracking drums just how far I would want to go with it. It wasn't until we had all the guitars and the vocals and everything else in that I was like, oh man, these drums need to like explode. But so in this case, I'm using a combination of the Disaster snare and the Smack snare. And both of these are available on my website over at bettermixes.com. So if you like them, go check them out. But anyway, let's hear these samples. So that's both of them together. Here's just the Disaster. So that's got some nice attack and definition and a bit of sustain there. But then let's hear the Smack. So that's like super compressed, has a lot of ring to it. So combining these two is just giving us a really cool, big, massive sound. Let's hear that one more time. And let's add that in with our actual mics. So you can hear that most of the character is still coming from the actual snare, but then this is just helping to lengthen it and add in some of that really aggressive, nasty, explosive ring. Let's check that out in context. So you can see, with the snare sample muted, it still sounds really good. I'm not using this sample to fix a bad snare sound. I'm just enhancing it a bit. And just to show you, let me crank up the snare a little bit without the sample, just so we're listening sort of at equal volume. So that sounds really great. Let's just duck that back down. I think it was somewhere around there. And put the sample back in. So yeah, just adding a little bit of extra excitement. And finally, let's just turn our reverbs on. I have them on both the top and the sample. And once again, let's listen to the full drum mix. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, be sure to leave a thumbs up and subscribe. Also, head on over to bettermixes.com to grab a free copy of my Ultimate EQ cheat sheet.